Sometimes the heart sees what the eyes refuse to notice. Sometimes love finds us in the places we least expect it, changing everything we thought we knew about ourselves. In the mountain wilderness of 1847, Silas McGraw had lived alone for 15 years, trapping and trading, avoiding the complications of human connection. When he found two sisters struggling to survive in a broken-down cabin, he planned to help them reach town and move on. Martha, the older sister, seemed strong and capable. But Clara, weakened by illness and walking with a limp, appeared to be nothing but trouble. Silas figured he'd help them both get to safety and forget about them. That was before one unexpected moment changed his entire understanding of what makes a person truly beautiful. What happens when a man discovers that the person he thought was weakest might actually be the strongest of all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Silas McGraw's hands moved with practiced precision as he sharpened his skinning knife against the whetstone, the rhythmic scraping sound echoing through his solitary cabin like a meditation. The worn leather journal beside him lay open to pages filled with meticulous entries, dates, weather patterns, trap locations, pelt counts. 15 years of careful notations that told the story of a man who had reduced his life to measurable, predictable elements. The cabin itself reflected this methodical nature. Every tool hung in its designated place on hand-hewn wooden pegs. Dried venison strips dangled from the rafters in neat rows. His tin plates and cups sat stacked with military precision on the rough-hewn table he'd built from pine logs. Not a single item existed without purpose, and not a single space harbored the clutter of sentiment or memory. Outside, the November wind howled through the towering pines that surrounded his dwelling like ancient sentinels. Snow had begun falling 3 days ago, fat flakes that promised a harsh winter ahead. Silas welcomed the isolation that the coming storms would bring. Winter meant months without seeing another human soul. Months of blessed solitude where he could tend his traps, cure his hides, and exist in the simple rhythm of survival. He closed the journal and ran his weathered fingers across the leather cover. 43 years old, and he could count on 2 hands the number of words he'd spoken aloud in the past month. He preferred it that way. Words led to connections. Connections led to complications, and complications led to the kind of pain he'd sworn never to endure again. The mountain had become his sanctuary after Sarah died. After little Thomas followed her into the ground just 3 months later, victims of the fever that swept through their Missouri settlement like wildfire. The memory still cut deep, his wife's gentle hands growing cold in his boy's laughter silenced forever. He'd buried them both under the oak tree behind their cabin, sold everything he owned, and headed west with nothing but his rifle, his traps, and a heart turned to stone. These mountains had welcomed his grief without judgment. They asked nothing of him except respect for their dangers and understanding of their moods. In return, they offered him beaver streams rich with pelts, game trails well worn by deer and elk, and caves where he could shelter during the worst storms. It was a fair trade, his humanity for their indifference. Silas rose from his chair and walked to the single window, peering through the thick glass he'd bartered for in Fort Collins 2 summers ago. The snow was falling heavier now, obscuring the familiar landmarks beyond his clearing. Tomorrow, he'd need to check his trapline one more time before the storm made travel impossible. After that, he could settle in for the long, peaceful months of winter solitude. He was reaching for his coat when movement caught his eye through the swirling snow. A dark shape stumbled between the trees, too large to be an animal, but moving with the desperate, unsteady gait of something wounded. Silas grabbed his rifle and stepped onto his porch, squinting into the white curtain of falling snow. "Help us!" a voice called out, barely audible above the wind. "Please, someone help us!" A woman emerged from the tree line, her dark hair plastered against her skull with melting snow, her face pale with exhaustion and cold. She wore a tattered woolen dress that had once been blue, but now looked more gray than anything else. Behind her, Another figure struggled through the deepening drifts, moving slowly and leaning heavily on a makeshift walking stick. Every instinct told Silas to retreat into his cabin and bar the door. Strangers meant complications. They meant questions he didn't want to answer and needs he didn't want to meet. But as the second figure stumbled and nearly fell, something deeper than self-preservation stirred within him. "This way," he called out, his voice rusty from disuse. The first woman, clearly the stronger of the two, half carried her companion toward his cabin. As they drew closer, Silas could see they were sisters, sharing the same oval face and dark eyes. The stronger one appeared to be in her mid-20s, with the lean build and steady movements of someone accustomed to hard work. The other was younger, perhaps 20, with delicate features that spoke of gentle upbringing rather than frontier hardship. "Thank God," the older sister gasped as they reached his porch. "I saw your light through the trees. We've been walking for 2 days." Silas hesitated for a moment, his hand still gripping the rifle. Then he saw the younger sister's face, pale as birch bark, her lips tinged blue with cold, her eyes holding a quiet dignity despite her obvious suffering. She leaned heavily on her walking stick, favoring her left leg in a way that spoke of permanent injury rather than temporary strain. "Get inside," he said, stepping back to let them pass. "You're near frozen." The cabin, which had felt spacious in solitude, suddenly seemed cramped with 3 people. The sisters huddled near his stone fireplace, while Silas added more wood to coax the flames higher. The older sister began speaking immediately, her words tumbling out in relief. "I'm Martha Whitmore, and this is my sister Clara. We were traveling to Denver to meet our uncle, but our guide abandoned us 3 days out from Fort Collins. Took our horses and most of our supplies while we slept." Her voice carried anger and hurt, but underneath lay steel determination. "We've been walking ever since, following what we hoped was a game trail toward higher ground." Silas glanced at Clara, who had said nothing but watched him with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his cabin. She held herself with careful dignity, despite her obvious exhaustion, and he noticed how she positioned herself to minimize the appearance of her limp. "Game trail leads to nowhere but deeper wilderness," Silas said, ladling hot coffee into 2 tin cups. "You're 20 miles from the nearest settlement, and that's as the crow flies. Through these mountains in winter might as well be 200. Martha's face fell. "Then we're trapped." "Storm's going to last 3, maybe 4 days," Silas continued, avoiding their eyes. "After that, snow will be too deep for travel until spring thaw." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Clara spoke for the first time, her voice soft but clear. "We understand this is an imposition, Mr. McGraw. Silas McGraw, Mr. McGraw. We understand this disrupts your life, but we have nowhere else to go." There was no pleading in her voice, no attempt at manipulation. She simply stated facts with the same quiet dignity she'd shown since arriving. Something about her directness unsettled him more than Martha's obvious desperation would have. "You can stay until the storm passes," he heard himself saying. "After that, we'll figure out how to get you to safety." Martha's relief was visible, but Clara simply nodded once, as if she'd expected nothing less and nothing more. She began removing her wet outer clothes with careful, deliberate movements that didn't call attention to her struggle with balance. As the evening progressed, Silas found himself observing both sisters with the same analytical eye he used to study animal behavior. Martha moved with confident efficiency, immediately taking charge of preparing their meager supplies and organizing their few possessions. She was clearly accustomed to leadership and responsibility, the kind of frontier woman who could handle whatever hardships came her way. Clara, by contrast, moved with measured grace despite her physical limitations. She offered to help with simple tasks, mending torn clothing, organizing supplies, but never pushed when her offers were declined. There was something watchful about her, as if she understood more about their situation than she revealed. "How long have you been out here alone?" Martha asked as they shared a simple meal of venison stew and hardtack. 15 years, give or take. Don't you miss people, conversation? Company?" Silas met her eyes briefly. No. Martha seemed ready to pursue the topic, but Clara touched her sister's arm gently. The younger sister understood boundaries in ways that Martha, for all her strength, did not. As night fell, Silas gave up his bed to the sisters and made himself a pallet near the fire. He lay awake, listening to their quiet whispers, Martha's voice carrying concern and planning, while Clara's responses came soft and reassuring. Despite her physical frailty, she seemed to be comforting her stronger sister rather than seeking comfort. The wind continued howling outside, driving snow against the cabin walls with increasing fury. Silas stared at the ceiling and tried to convince himself that this was temporary, a brief disruption that would resolve itself in a few days. But something told him that the storm outside was nothing compared to the changes these two women had brought into his carefully ordered world. In the darkness, he could hear Clara's gentle breathing, steady and peaceful despite her exhaustion. Martha had fallen silent, but Clara remained awake. And somehow Silas knew she was staring at the same ceiling he was, thinking thoughts he couldn't begin to guess. For the first time in 15 years, Silas McGraw fell asleep to the sound of another person's presence, and despite himself, he found it less disturbing than he'd expected. The storm raged for 4 days, with a fury that Silas had rarely witnessed in his 15 years on the mountain. Wind-driven snow piled against the cabin walls in drifts that reached nearly to the windows, and the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the glass, despite the roaring fire. On the second day, Clara's condition worsened dramatically. Silas woke to find Martha kneeling beside the bed, where her sister lay shivering, despite the pile of blankets covering her. Clara's face was flushed with fever, and her breathing came in short, labored gasps. "She's burning up," Martha whispered, her usual confidence replaced by raw fear. "This happens sometimes when she gets too cold or exhausted. Her body just gives up fighting." Silas approached the bed cautiously. He'd seen fever before. It was fever that had taken Sarah and Thomas. But something about Clara's condition seemed different, as if her body was fighting multiple battles at once. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Martha looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Help me cool her down. We need cold water, lots of it. And we need to get these wet clothes off her." For a moment Silas hesitated. The intimacy of caring for a sick woman brought back memories he'd buried deep. But Clara's labored breathing decided the matter for him. They worked together through the morning, taking turns applying cool cloths to Clara's burning skin and forcing spoonfuls of water between her parched lips. Martha did most of the intimate care, but there were moments when Silas had to help lift Clara or support her while Martha changed the bedding beneath her. It was during one of these moments, as he held Clara's slight frame while Martha worked, that Silas truly saw her for the first time. Without the layers of worn clothing and careful positioning that normally hid her condition, he could see that her left leg was indeed twisted, the result of some old injury that had healed poorly. But he could also see the quiet strength in her shoulders, the graceful curve of her neck, the way she fought to remain conscious despite the fever's grip. "She's always been the strong one," Martha said softly, noticing his gaze. "People look at her and see weakness because of her leg. They don't see how she kept us going after our parents died. They don't see how she never complains, never asks for help she doesn't absolutely need." Clara's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her sister's voice. They were unfocused with fever, but they found Silas's face and held his gaze with startling clarity. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry to be such trouble." Something twisted in Silas's chest at those words. Here was a woman fighting for her life, apologizing for the inconvenience her suffering might cause others. "You're not trouble," he heard himself saying. "You just need to rest and get better." She tried to smile, a ghost of expression that somehow conveyed more gratitude than 1,000 words. Then her eyes closed again, and she drifted back into fevered sleep as the day wore on. Martha began sharing their story in fragments, speaking partly to fill the worried silence and partly, Silas suspected, Because she needed to tell someone who would listen without judgment. Their parents had been killed 6 months ago when their homestead was raided by a gang of desperate men looking for supplies and horses. Martha and Clara had hidden in the root cellar during the attack, emerging hours later to find their world destroyed. Their father had been shot defending their mother, who had died trying to reach him. Clara wanted to stay and rebuild, Martha said, smoothing her sister's damp hair back from her forehead. She said the land was all we had left of them. But I knew we couldn't make it alone. Clara's strong in spirit, but her body, it's always been fragile. The injury to her leg happened when she was 12. A horse spooked and kicked her. The doctor in town said he could fix it, but it would require surgery, and there was no guarantee she'd walk again at all. What happened? Martha's expression grew complicated, shadows of old guilt crossing her features. We couldn't afford the surgery. Father said we'd find another way, but there never was another way. The bone healed crooked, and Clara learned to live with it. There was something in Martha's voice that suggested more to the story, but before Silas could pursue it, Clara began to stir restlessly. The fever was breaking, and with it came the violent shivering that often followed. They spent the next several hours layering blankets over her and keeping the fire high. Silas found himself taking his turn at watching over her while Martha rested, studying her face in the firelight, and trying to understand why this particular woman's suffering affected him so deeply. Perhaps it was because she bore her pain with such dignity. Perhaps it was because she worried more about being a burden than about her own comfort. Or perhaps it was simply because she was the first person in 15 years to look at him without wanting something he wasn't prepared to give. By the 4th day, Clara was sitting up and taking broth, though she remained pale and weak. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. When Silas ventured outside to check his traps and survey the damage, he found drifts higher than his head and temperatures that would kill an unprepared traveler within hours. "How long before we can travel?" Martha asked when he returned. Silas hung his coat on its peg and considered his answer carefully. 6 weeks, maybe 8. Snow's too deep now and more storms are coming. Even if you could make the journey, there's nowhere to shelter between here and town. The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken implications. Clara was propped up in a chair near the fire, wrapped in blankets and looking fragile as spun glass. Martha stood at the window, staring out at the endless white landscape with the expression of someone calculating impossible odds. "We'll make the best of it," Clara said quietly. "We won't be idle. I can cook and mend. Martha can help with whatever work needs doing. We'll earn our keep." "It's not about earning anything," Silas replied, surprised by his own words. "It's about surviving until spring." That evening, as they shared another simple meal, Silas found himself really talking to another person for the first time in years. Clara asked thoughtful questions about mountain life, about the animals and weather patterns, about how he'd learned to read the signs that meant survival or death in the wilderness. Her curiosity was genuine, not the idle chatter of someone trying to fill silence. She listened to his answers with the focused attention of someone truly interested in understanding. When she asked about his traps and how they worked, he found himself describing techniques he'd never bothered to explain to anyone. "You really love it here," she observed. "This life, this place, it suits you." The comment caught him off guard, because it wasn't what people usually said about his chosen isolation. Most folks who encountered him assumed he was running from something or hiding from the world. Clara seemed to understand that he'd found something instead. As they prepared for sleep that night, the reality of their situation settled over all three of them. They would be sharing this small space for months, learning each other's habits and rhythms, becoming intimate in ways that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with survival. Martha took the bed again, but Clara insisted on making her own pallet near the fire. As Silas arranged his blankets on the floor, he was acutely aware of her presence just a few feet away. For the first time in 15 years, he fell asleep listening to another person's breathing. And for the first time in 15 years, he didn't mind, but in the darkness, Questions began forming that he wasn't ready to answer. Questions about what would happen when spring came and they had to leave. Questions about why the thought of Clara's departure already felt like another kind of loss. And most disturbing of all, questions about whether his carefully constructed solitude was the sanctuary he'd always believed it to be, or simply another kind of prison. Living in close quarters quickly stripped away the polite formalities that had marked their first few days together. By the end of the first week, they had settled into routines that felt both natural and strangely intimate. Silas rose before dawn each day to tend the fire and check his traps closest to the cabin. Martha proved herself capable with the hunting rifle her father had left her, and Silas began teaching her to read animal signs and set snares. Clara, despite her physical limitations, took charge of the domestic tasks with quiet efficiency that impressed them both. The small cabin filled with new scents. Clara's cooking transformed Silas's simple fare into meals that actually had flavor. She somehow made dried venison and stored vegetables taste like something worth anticipating. Her presence changed the space in subtler ways, too. She arranged things for both beauty and function, creating small touches of comfort that Silas hadn't realized he'd been missing. Martha's hunting rifle became a daily companion as she accompanied Silas on his shorter trap runs. She was a natural shot with good instincts for tracking, and her enthusiasm for learning frontier skills sometimes reminded Silas of the eager students he'd known in his younger days, before grief had driven him to the mountains. "You're a good teacher," Martha told him one afternoon as they returned from checking snares. She'd successfully tracked a rabbit trail and set her own trap exactly where Silas would have placed it. Patient, clear, not like some men who act like sharing knowledge diminishes them somehow. They were walking single file through the snow, Martha following in Silas's broken trail. He could hear the smile in her voice, even without seeing her face, and something about her tone made him glance back. She was watching him with an expression that was warmer than simple gratitude. "Knowledge isn't much good if it dies with you," he replied, turning back to focus on the path ahead. But he'd seen enough in that brief glance to recognize the direction of Martha's thoughts. It wasn't surprising. She was an attractive woman in need of protection, and he was the only available man. What surprised him was how little the recognition affected him. Martha was everything a frontier woman should be: strong, capable, ready for whatever hardships came. She would make someone a fine wife and partner. But when he tried to imagine her in that role with him, the image felt flat and unconvincing. Back at the cabin, Clara was always waiting with hot coffee and gentle questions about their day. She listened to Martha's excited accounts of tracking success, and Silas's practical observations about weather patterns with equal attention. But Silas noticed that her eyes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking, and her questions about the mountain life seemed to come from genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. "Do you ever miss the settlements?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "Music, books, conversation with people who share your interests?" It was the kind of question that would have annoyed him coming from someone else, an implied criticism of his chosen solitude. But Clara's tone held no judgment, only genuine wonder about how someone could find fulfillment in such isolation. "I brought what I needed," he said. "Books, tools, skills. As for conversation—" He paused, surprised to find himself considering the question seriously. "Most talk is just noise. People filling silence because they're afraid of what they might hear in it. And what do you hear in the silence?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. He looked at her across the fire, noting how the flames highlighted the intelligence in her dark eyes. She wasn't making small talk. She genuinely wanted to understand. "Peace," he said finally. "Or I used to." The admission surprised them both. Clara tilted her head slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "And now—" Before he could answer, Martha returned from washing dishes at the water basin, and the moment passed. But throughout the rest of the evening, Silas found himself stealing glances at Clara and wondering What had made him so willing to reveal thoughts he'd never shared with anyone? As the days passed, the dynamic between the three of them grew more complex. Martha's interest in Silas became increasingly obvious, expressed through small gestures, standing closer than necessary when he showed her how to skin a rabbit, finding excuses to touch his arm when making a point, lingering near him when they worked together. Clara, meanwhile, seemed to be withdrawing into herself. She continued to manage the household tasks with quiet competence, but she spoke less and spent long periods sitting by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with an expression that was difficult to read. "Is your sister all right?" Silas asked Martha one day when they were checking traps together. Martha glanced back toward the cabin, her expression troubled. "Clara's always been thoughtful. She sees things the rest of us miss, understands currents beneath the surface. Sometimes I think it's a burden for her, being so aware of other people's feelings." "What do you mean?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, focusing on resetting a sprung trap. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. "Clara has a way of putting other people's happiness before her own. She's done it since we were children. She sees what people need and finds ways to give it to them, even when it costs her something." There was something in Martha's tone that suggested deeper layers to this observation. But before Silas could pursue it, she changed the subject to the weather signs and the likelihood of another storm. That evening, Silas found himself studying Clara more carefully. She was mending one of his shirts with tiny, precise stitches that transformed the crude repair into something approaching art. Her hands moved with practiced skill, but her attention seemed focused somewhere beyond the fabric. "You're quiet tonight," he said. She looked up with a slight smile. "I'm always quiet. This is different." For a moment he thought she might not answer. Then she set down her mending and met his eyes directly. "I've been thinking about spring," she said. "About what happens when the snow melts and we can travel again." "What about it?" "Martha's strong enough to make a new life wherever we end up. She has the skills to attract a good husband, to build something lasting. But she gestured vaguely at her damaged leg. "I'm not sure what kind of future is possible for someone like me." The resignation in her voice stirred something angry in Silas's chest. "Someone like you?" "You know what I mean. A woman with my limitations. In most places, I'd be seen as a burden, a responsibility for my husband rather than a partner. Then most places are full of fools." The words came out more forcefully than he'd intended, surprising them both. Clara stared at him with wide eyes, and from across the room, Martha looked up from her own tasks with sharp attention. "I mean," Silas continued, his voice carefully controlled, "any man who can't see past a limp to recognize intelligence and strength isn't worth considering." Clara's smile was soft and grateful, but there was sadness in it too. "You're kind to say so. But kindness doesn't change the world we live in." Later that night, as they prepared for sleep, Silas found himself thinking about Clara's words. She was right about the world's judgment. He'd seen enough to know how society treated those it deemed imperfect. But she was wrong about her own worth, and the fact that she couldn't see it troubled him more than it should have. In the darkness, he listened to the sound of her breathing and tried to understand why this particular woman's happiness had begun to matter to him so much. The answer, when it came, was as unwelcome as it was undeniable. He was beginning to care for her in ways that had nothing to do with duty or hospitality, and everything to do with the heart he'd thought he'd buried with Sarah and Thomas. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a complex mixture of hope and guilt that kept him awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how three strangers sharing a cabin in a snowstorm had managed to change the careful order of his solitary world. The turning point came on a crystalline morning in early December when Silas discovered Clara sitting on his porch despite the bitter cold. Surrounded by small piles of pressed flowers she'd somehow preserved from her journey. "You'll freeze out here," he said, stepping outside with 2 cups of coffee. "I needed the light," she replied, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "These were my mother's. I've been carrying them since we left home." But I finally decided to make something with them. She was creating a small picture, using the dried flowers, arranging them with tweezers she'd fashioned from wire. The design was delicate and beautiful, a mountain landscape rendered in petals and stems that captured something essential about the wilderness surrounding them. She taught me this when I was small, Clara continued, her breath visible in the cold air. Said that beauty was worth preserving, even when everything else was falling apart. Silas studied the artwork, struck by both its technical skill and the emotion it conveyed. It's remarkable. It helps me think. Keeps my hands busy while my mind works through problems. What problems? Clara was quiet for a moment, adjusting a tiny flower with careful precision. Martha's in love with you. The direct statement caught him completely off guard. He nearly spilled his coffee, and Clara glanced up with a small, knowing smile. She is, Clara continued when he didn't respond. And I think she believes you might return her feelings. I don't, Silas said quickly. I know. You know? Clara returned her attention to the flowers, but he could see a flush creeping up her neck that had nothing to do with the cold. I know because you look at me the way she looks at you. The confession hung between them in the crisp air, as delicate and dangerous as the ice forming on the cabin's eaves. Silas felt his carefully constructed emotional walls beginning to crack, and with them came a rush of feelings he'd spent 15 years trying to avoid. Clara, we should go inside, she said quietly, beginning to gather her materials. Before we both say things that complicate an already impossible situation, but they didn't move immediately. They sat in the cold morning air, drinking coffee and pretending to admire the mountain vista while actually stealing glances at each other and trying to navigate the sudden shift in their relationship. Why impossible? Silas asked finally, Clara's hands stilled on her flower arrangement. Because Martha's my sister. Because she's stronger and more suitable for this life. Because I'm already enough of a burden without adding romantic complications to the mix. You're not a burden. I'm a woman who can barely walk. Silas, in a world where survival depends on physical capability, that makes me a liability no matter how you try to dress it up with kind words. The bitterness in her voice was unlike anything he'd heard from her before. It revealed depths of pain and self-doubt that she kept carefully hidden beneath her gentle demeanor. Is that really what you think? He asked. That your worth is measured by how fast you can walk or how much weight you can carry, isn't it? The question came out as barely a whisper. Silas set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. In the past month, you've organized our supplies so efficiently that we'll have enough food to last through a hard winter. You've cooked meals that made me remember why eating can be pleasure instead of just fuel. You've mended our clothes with such skill that they're stronger than when they were new. You've created beauty in a place that had forgotten what beauty looked like. He paused, searching for words that could convey what he was beginning to understand. You've made a house feel like a home for the first time in 15 years. If that's not valuable, then I don't understand the meaning of the word. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back with characteristic determination. You're very kind. I'm not kind. I'm honest. There's a difference. They were interrupted by Martha's voice calling from inside the cabin. The spell broke, and they gathered Clara's materials quickly, but the conversation had changed something fundamental between them. As they went inside, Silas was acutely aware of Clara's presence beside him in ways that made him feel like a young man again, nervous, hopeful and terrified in equal measure. Over the following days, the tension in the cabin became almost palpable. Martha continued her obvious attempts to capture Silas's romantic attention, while Clara withdrew further into herself, speaking only when necessary and avoiding eye contact with both of them. Silas found himself caught between conflicting loyalties and desires. Martha had done nothing wrong. She was a fine woman who deserved better than unrequited affection. But every conversation with her felt forced and artificial, while every moment with Clara felt charged with possibilities he wasn't sure he was brave enough to explore. The crisis came to a head one evening, when Martha cornered him while Clara was resting. I need to ask you something directly, Martha said, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly. Is there a future for us? When spring comes and we can make a new start somewhere, could you see yourself? Could we build something together? The question deserved an honest answer, no matter how painful. Martha, you're an exceptional woman. Strong, capable, everything a man could want in a partner. But you're in love with my sister. The words hit him like a physical blow, partly because they were true, and partly because he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge the truth until Martha spoke it aloud. It's not that simple, isn't it? Martha's voice carried hurt, but also a kind of resigned understanding. I've watched you both, trying to pretend there's nothing between you. I've seen how you look at her when you think no one's watching. I've seen how she lights up when you pay attention to her, then withdraws because she thinks she's betraying me somehow. Silas ran his hands through his hair, feeling trapped by circumstances he hadn't sought and didn't know how to resolve. She's right to worry about betraying you. Your sisters. Family comes first, does it? Martha moved to the window, staring out at the snow. Clara spent her whole life putting everyone else's needs before her own. Our parents always favored her because she was gentle and sweet, but they also expected her to sacrifice her own happiness for the family's welfare. When our father couldn't afford the surgery to fix her leg, Clara never complained. When boys showed interest in her and then lost interest when they learned about her condition, she pretended it didn't hurt. When I wanted to leave home after our parents died, she agreed, even though she wanted to stay, because she thought it would make me happy. Martha turned back to face him, and Silas was surprised to see tears in her eyes. I love my sister more than anyone in this world, but I'm tired of watching her sacrifice herself for everyone else's comfort. If she can find happiness with you, if you can see past her limitations to the woman she really is, then I won't stand in the way. And what about you? Martha's smile was sad but genuine. I'll find my own happiness. I'm strong enough to start over, to build a life without depending on anyone else. Clara deserves the chance to discover if she's strong enough too. That night, as they prepared for sleep, the atmosphere in the cabin felt different, charged with unspoken possibilities and the weight of decisions that couldn't be delayed much longer. Clara seemed to sense the change, glancing between Martha and Silas with growing awareness that something significant had shifted. As Silas lay in his blankets, listening to the wind outside, he realized that his carefully ordered solitary life had been thoroughly disrupted by forces he couldn't control. For 15 years, he'd convinced himself that isolation was safety, that avoiding connection meant avoiding pain. But Clara had shown him that some connections were worth the risk, and Martha had shown him that love sometimes meant having the courage to reach for happiness instead of settling for mere survival. The question now was whether he was brave enough to take the step that would change all their lives forever. The revelation came by accident 3 days later, when Clara knocked over Silas's wooden storage box while trying to retrieve a dropped needle. The contents scattered across the floor: tools, spare leather, ammunition, and something that shouldn't have been there at all. Clara picked up the small object with trembling fingers. It was a woman's wedding ring, simple gold worn smooth by years of wear, attached to a delicate chain that suggested it had been worn close to someone's heart. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, setting the ring back in the box. "I didn't mean to—" "It's all right." Silas's voice was rough with emotions he'd thought he'd buried. He knelt beside her to gather the scattered items, his movements careful and deliberate. "That was my wife's ring." The simple statement carried the weight of years of grief. Clara remained kneeling beside him, her presence offering comfort without demanding explanations. "Her name was Sarah," Silas continued, surprising himself with his willingness to speak. "We were married 8 years. Lost her and our boy Thomas to fever the same winter. I'm so sorry." Clara's voice held genuine compassion, free of the awkward sympathy that made most condolences feel hollow. Something about her quiet understanding loosened the tight knot of pain that had lived in Silas's chest for 15 years. She She was everything good about the world. Kind, patient, always seeing the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Thomas had her smile, her way of finding joy in simple things. He paused, studying the ring in his weathered hands. I brought this to the mountains because I thought keeping it close would help me remember them. Instead, it just reminded me of everything I'd lost. And now, the question was gentle, inviting rather than demanding. Silas looked at Clara's face, noting the way the firelight caught the gold flecks in her dark eyes, the compassion that seemed to radiate from her very being. Now I think maybe it's time to remember the love instead of just the loss. The words surprised them both. For 15 years, Silas had worn his grief like armor, using it to justify his isolation and his refusal to risk his heart again. But sitting here with Clara, he began to understand the difference between honoring the dead and being held prisoner by them. "Tell me about them," Clara said softly. So he did. For the first time since their deaths, Silas spoke about Sarah and Thomas not as sources of pain, but as people he had loved. He described Sarah's laugh, her terrible cooking before she learned to improve, the way she hummed while she worked. He talked about Thomas's fascination with everything that moved, his endless questions, his sticky-fingered hugs that could cure any bad day. Clara listened without judgment or advice, simply allowing him to share memories that had been locked away too long. When he finished, the cabin felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the very air. "They sound wonderful," Clara said. "You were lucky to have them even for a short time." "I was. But for years, I thought the luck was in the having. Now I'm beginning to think maybe the real luck is in being able to love at all." Martha chose that moment to return from her evening walk, and the intimate conversation ended. But something fundamental had shifted between Silas and Clara. The grief that had defined him for so long was no longer a wall between them, but rather a bridge to deeper understanding. Over the following days, Clara began sharing her own memories. She spoke of her parents, her father's quiet strength and her mother's artistic soul. She described the homestead they'd built together, the dreams they'd had for their daughters' futures. "Mother used to say that love was like her flower pressing," Clara said one evening as she worked on a new arrangement. "You had to handle it carefully, preserve it properly, but once you did, it could last forever. Is that why you make these?" Clara nodded, adding a delicate mountain violet to her design. "Each one holds a memory, a moment of beauty worth keeping. This violet reminds me of the first spring, after I was injured, when I thought I'd never enjoy walking in the meadows again. Mother helped me see that there were different ways to experience beauty, different paths to the same joy." Silas studied the intricate artwork, beginning to understand that Clara's flower pressing was more than a hobby. It was a philosophy of life, a way of finding meaning and beauty despite limitations and loss. "What happened to your leg?" he asked gently, Clara's hands stilled on her work. For a moment he thought she might not answer. Then she set down her tweezers and met his eyes. "I was 12. Our neighbor's stallion spooked during a thunderstorm and broke through his corral. I was trying to help catch him when he kicked me. The bone broke in several places. Martha said there was a doctor who could have helped." Something flickered across Clara's face, a shadow of old pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. "Dr. Patterson said he could fix it with surgery, but it would be expensive and dangerous. Father wanted to try, but Martha convinced him it was too risky. She said I was too weak to survive such an operation, that we should be grateful I was alive at all." The words were spoken without bitterness, but Silas heard the hurt beneath Clara's careful composure. He also heard something else, a story that didn't quite make sense. "You were 12, old enough to have an opinion about your own medical treatment. I was also scared and in pain." Martha was 16, nearly grown. "Everyone thought she was being practical, looking out for my best interests, but there was something in Clara's voice that suggested she'd wondered, even then, whether Martha's concerns had been entirely selfless." Silas found himself remembering Martha's reaction when he'd complimented Clara's strength, the guilt that had flickered across her features. Do you regret not having the surgery? Clara was quiet for a long moment, arranging and rearranging the flowers in her design. I regret not having the choice, she said finally. I regret that other people decided what my life would be based on what they thought I could handle. But I don't regret who I became because of it. Difficulty can teach compassion in ways that easy living never does. The quiet wisdom in her words humbled him. Here was a woman who had been denied opportunities because of other people's assumptions about her limitations. Yet she had found ways to create meaning and beauty despite those constraints. That night, as the wind howled outside and snow continued to fall, Silas lay awake thinking about choices and second chances. Sarah's ring lay on the table beside his pallet, no longer a source of pain, but a reminder that love, once experienced, left a person forever changed. For the first time in 15 years, he found himself imagining a future that included another person, not as a replacement for what he'd lost, but as something entirely new and different. The thought terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Across the cabin, he could hear Clara's gentle breathing and Martha's deeper sleep. Two sisters who had survived loss and hardship, each in her own way. But where Martha had responded with determination to overcome obstacles, Clara had responded with acceptance and the wisdom to find different paths to the same destinations. As sleep finally claimed him, Silas realized that his heart, which he'd thought permanently damaged by grief, was slowly learning to hope again. The question was whether he had the courage to act on that hope, and whether Clara would be willing to take the risk of loving a man who was still learning how to emerge from 15 years of self-imposed exile. The music box appeared on a quiet January afternoon when Clara was sorting through the few personal belongings they'd managed to salvage from their journey. Silas heard the delicate melody first, a simple lullaby that seemed to transform the rustic cabin into something more refined and gentle. He found Clara sitting by the window, holding a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. The melody drifted from it like a ghost of better times, and tears tracked silently down her cheeks. "My mother's," she said when she noticed him watching. "The only thing of real value we managed to bring." Silas approached carefully, recognizing the fragility of the moment. The music box was exquisite, clearly crafted by a master artisan, and probably worth more than most frontier families saw in a year. "She played it every night when Martha and I were small," Clara continued, her voice thick with memory. "Said the music would keep the nightmares away and fill our dreams with beautiful things." The lullaby was hauntingly lovely, with a melody that spoke of old-world craftsmanship and cultural traditions that seemed impossibly distant from their mountain refuge. As Clara closed the box, stopping the music, the cabin felt somehow diminished by the silence. "Does it work? The keeping nightmares away?" Clara's smile was sad but genuine. "Sometimes, though I think it works better at bringing back good memories than preventing bad dreams. Tell me about her." "Your mother?" Clara opened the music box again, letting the melody fill the space between them. "Elena Whitmore. She was born in Boston to a family that had money and education. She could have married well, lived comfortably in society. Instead, she fell in love with a farmer's son who dreamed of building something lasting in the West." The story unfolded slowly, punctuated by the delicate music. Elena had been accomplished in all the refined arts, music, painting, literature, but she'd also possessed the steel core necessary to survive frontier life. She'd taught her daughters to read and write, to appreciate beauty and create it, but also to endure hardship with grace. "She made our little homestead feel like a palace sometimes," Clara said. "Fresh flowers on the table whenever possible, music in the evenings, stories about faraway places. She refused to let the wilderness make us wild." "Is that where you learned about flowers?" "The pressing and arranging? Partly. But she taught me something more important, that beauty isn't a luxury for people who have easy lives. It's a necessity for people who don't. When everything around you is hard and uncertain, creating something beautiful becomes an act of faith in the future." Silas understood. His own cabin, functional as it was, had been purely utilitarian until Clara's presence had begun transforming it into something warmer and more welcoming. Small changes, flowers arranged in a tin cup, clothing mended with decorative stitches, meals presented with care rather than just sustenance, had altered the very atmosphere of the place. She sounds remarkable. She was. But she was also— Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. She was fragile in ways that frontier life couldn't accommodate. The isolation wore on her, the constant struggle to maintain civilized standards in an uncivilized place. Sometimes I think she gave too much of herself trying to create beauty for everyone else. There was something in Clara's tone that suggested deeper understanding, a recognition of patterns that might repeat across generations. Silas found himself studying her face, noting the way she held herself with careful composure, even when discussing painful memories. "Do you worry about following in her footsteps?" The question surprised Clara into meeting his eyes directly. For a moment, her careful mask slipped, revealing depths of vulnerability she usually kept hidden. "Every day," she admitted. "I see how I try to make things better for Martha, for you, for everyone around me. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just repeating Mother's mistakes, giving so much of myself away that there's nothing left for me. What would be left for you? If you stopped trying to make everyone else's life better?" Clara was quiet for a long time, absently tracing the mother-of-pearl inlay on the music box. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I've been taking care of other people for so long that I'm not sure who I am when I'm not needed." The confession broke Silas's heart in ways he hadn't expected. Here was a woman who had spent her entire life defining herself through service to others, never considering her own worth beyond her usefulness. "You're someone worth knowing for her own sake," he said firmly. "Someone whose thoughts and dreams and desires matter just as much as anyone else's." "Do they?" The question came out small and uncertain, like a child asking for reassurance about something fundamental to their understanding of the world. "They do to me." The words hung between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to explore fully. Clara's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from her earlier grief. These carried hope mixed with disbelief. Before either could say more, Martha returned from her afternoon hunt, successful judging by the pair of rabbits slung over her shoulder. The intimate moment shattered, but its effects lingered in the heightened awareness between Silas and Clara. That evening, as Martha cleaned her catch and Clara prepared vegetables for stew, Silas found himself observing the sisters' dynamic with new understanding. Martha moved with confident efficiency, comfortable in her role as provider and protector. But Clara's movements held a different kind of grace, the careful consideration of someone who had learned to find meaning in small acts of creation and care. "Beautiful music earlier," Martha commented as they sat down to eat. "I could hear it from quite a distance. Mother's lullaby always did carry well. It reminded me of the evenings when we were small," Clara replied. "All of us gathered around the fire while she played and told stories." "Simpler times," Martha agreed, but there was something in her expression that didn't quite match her nostalgic words. "Though I suppose Mother's stories always made frontier life sound more romantic than it really was. She was trying to give us hope, was she? Or was she trying to convince herself that leaving civilization behind was worth the sacrifice?" The edge in Martha's voice surprised both Clara and Silas. It was the first time Martha had expressed anything less than complete reverence for their parents' memory. "She loved Father," Clara said quietly. "She chose this life because she loved him, did she? Or did she just convince herself she loved him because the alternative was admitting she'd made a terrible mistake?" The harsh words fell into uncomfortable silence. Clara stared at her sister with wide eyes, clearly shocked by the bitterness in Martha's voice. "Why would you say such a thing?" Martha set down her spoon, her expression troubled. "Because I remember the nights when she cried herself to sleep thinking we couldn't hear. I remember how she used to stare east toward the settlements with such longing. I remember how she faded a little more each year until there was hardly anything left of the woman she used to be. She was happy, Clara insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. She was dutiful. There's a difference. The conversation continued in tense, careful phrases, revealing fault lines in the sisters' shared memories that neither had acknowledged before. Silas listened with growing understanding of the forces that had shaped both women, Clara's determination to find beauty and meaning despite hardship, and Martha's equally strong determination never to sacrifice herself for anyone else's dreams. As they prepared for sleep that night, the atmosphere in the cabin felt charged with unspoken tensions and revelations. Clara wound her music box and let the lullaby play one more time. But the melody that had seemed purely nostalgic earlier now carried undertones of loss and questioning. Lying in his blankets, Silas thought about the different ways people responded to hardship and disappointment. Some, like Martha, emerged stronger and more determined to control their own destiny. Others, like Clara, learned to find grace and beauty in circumstances they couldn't change. And some, like Elena Whitmore, simply wore away under the constant pressure of trying to maintain impossible standards. The question that haunted him as he drifted towards sleep was which path his own heart was choosing, and whether loving Clara meant protecting her from the kind of gradual erosion that had claimed her mother, or helping her discover the strength to choose her own course regardless of what others expected from her. The letter surfaced when Clara accidentally knocked over Martha's travel pack while reaching for more firewood. Among the scattered contents, spare clothing, ammunition, dried rations, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor like a leaf from some forbidden tree. Silas bent to retrieve it, noting the careful handwriting and official-looking seal. But before he could hand it back, Clara's sharp intake of breath stopped him cold. "Martha," Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "What is this?" Martha froze in the doorway, her arms full of wood she'd been gathering. Her eyes fixed on the letter in Silas's hand, and her face went white as the snow outside. "Clara, I can explain. Dr. Patterson's letter. The one about my leg." Clara's voice gained strength and incredulity in equal measure. "You kept Dr. Patterson's letter." Silas looked down at the paper in his hands, beginning to understand that he was holding something that could change everything they thought they knew about the past. The letter bore an official medical seal and was dated 15 years ago. "Read it," Clara commanded, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Please, Mr. McGraw, read it aloud." Martha dropped the firewood with a crash that seemed to echo through the small cabin. "Clara, please. Let me explain first. Read it." Silas unfolded the letter with careful fingers, his heart sinking as he began to understand what he was about to reveal. The handwriting was precise and professional. "Dear Mr. Whitmore," he began, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Regarding your daughter Clara's injury, I want to assure you that surgical repair is not only possible, but highly recommended. The break is clean and well-positioned for healing. With proper surgical intervention within the next few months, I'm confident that Clara will regain full use of her leg with minimal permanent impairment." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. Silas continued reading, each word falling like stones into still water. "The procedure is delicate but well within my capabilities. I have performed similar surgeries with excellent results. The cost would be $40, payable over time if necessary. The only significant risk is waiting too long. If the bone is allowed to heal improperly, corrective surgery becomes far more complicated and less likely to succeed." The letter concluded with detailed instructions for pre-surgical care and an earnest plea not to delay the decision. When Silas finished reading, the silence in the cabin was deafening. Clara stood motionless beside the overturned pack, staring at her sister with an expression of dawning comprehension. Martha remained frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. $40, Clara said quietly. "Not hundreds like you told Father. $40 that we had saved for winter supplies. Clara, you told Father I was too weak for surgery. You told him the doctor said I might die on the table. You told him it would cost more than we could possibly afford." Martha's composure finally cracked completely. She sank to her knees among the scattered firewood, her whole body shaking with sobs. "I was 16 years old and terrified," she choked out. "You were always Father's favorite, Mother's precious, gentle daughter. You got all the attention, all the concern. For once, someone was focused on me, asking my opinion, treating me like the responsible one." The words poured out in a torrent of long-suppressed guilt and resentment. "I told myself I was protecting you from a dangerous surgery. I convinced myself that you were better off learning to live with limitations than risking everything on an operation that might fail. But the truth is I was jealous. I was tired of being the strong one while you got to be fragile and precious." Clara's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, anger, and finally something that looked like understanding mixed with profound sadness. "You let me believe I was broken beyond repair. You let me spend 15 years thinking I was a burden, that I could never be a full partner to anyone." "I know," Martha whispered. "I've regretted it every day since. But by the time I understood what I'd done, it was too late. The bone had healed wrong, and I didn't know how to take back the lies I'd told." Silas found himself caught between rage at Martha's deception and sorrow for the young woman she'd been. Frightened, jealous, and too immature to understand the consequences of her choices. But his primary concern was for Clara, who stood like a statue amid the wreckage of everything she'd believed about her own limitations. "Dr. Patterson mentioned corrective surgery," Silas said carefully. Even after improper healing, Clara's eyes snapped to his face. "What?" He reread the relevant passage. "If the bone is allowed to heal improperly, corrective surgery becomes far more complicated and less likely to succeed." "Less likely," Clara repeated. "Not impossible." The hope in her voice was painful to hear. Silas wanted to encourage it, but he also didn't want to promise something that might not be achievable. "I'm not a doctor," he said, "but I've set bones before, animal and human. If the original break was as clean as Dr. Patterson described, and if the healing was only slightly misaligned—" He trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought without more information. But Clara was already moving toward him, her eyes bright with possibility. "Could you examine it? Could you tell if corrective surgery might be possible?" Silas glanced at Martha, who was still kneeling among the firewood, looking small and broken herself. Then he looked back at Clara, seeing in her face a hunger for hope that went far beyond physical healing. "I could try. But Clara, even if the bone structure looks promising, re-breaking and resetting a leg is dangerous. The risk of infection, of things going wrong." "I understand the risks," Clara said firmly. "What I need to understand is whether there's any chance at all." The examination took place with Martha reluctantly assisting, her guilt making her desperate to help in any way possible. Silas's experienced hands traced the lines of Clara's mishealed leg, feeling for the places where bone had knit improperly. What he found was both encouraging and heartbreaking. The original break had indeed been clean, just as Dr. Patterson had said. The misalignment was significant but not catastrophic, the kind of healing that spoke of inadequate setting rather than severe damage. "It's possible," he said finally, sitting back on his heels. "The bone would need to be broken again and properly set. The healing would take months, and there would be considerable pain. But yes, I think there's a real chance you could walk normally." Clara's tears came then, 15 years of suppressed grief and frustration and dreams she'd been afraid to acknowledge. Martha crawled over to take her sister's hands, her own face streaked with tears of guilt and desperate hope for forgiveness. "I'm so sorry," Martha whispered. "I'm so sorry for what I stole from you. If you want to try the surgery, I'll help however I can. I'll take care of you through the healing. "No," Clara said quietly, pulling her hands free. Martha's face crumpled with despair. "You can't forgive me. I understand. I don't deserve—" "No, that's not what I mean." Clara's voice was steady now, filled with a new kind of strength. "I mean, I won't let you take care of me through this. I won't let you try to earn forgiveness by making yourself indispensable to my recovery." She looked at Silas, and he saw in her eyes a determination he'd never witnessed before. If I do this, if we attempt the surgery, I want to do it for me, not to make you feel better about the past, not to prove anything to anyone else. For me, because I deserve the chance to choose my own limitations." The conversation that followed was long and difficult, involving medical details, emotional reckonings, and practical considerations about timing and recovery. But by the end of it, 3 people who had entered the day as one version of themselves emerged as something entirely different. Clara had discovered that her perceived weaknesses were largely constructed by other people's choices rather than her own inherent limitations. Martha had confronted the consequences of decisions made in fear and jealousy 15 years earlier. And Silas had realized that loving someone sometimes meant helping them take risks that terrified you, because their freedom to choose was more important than your need to protect them. As they prepared for sleep that night, the cabin felt different, charged with possibility and weighted with the knowledge that their carefully balanced dynamic was about to change forever. Tomorrow they would begin planning for surgery that could transform Clara's life or end it. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Clara went to sleep, believing that she had the right to make her own choices about her future, regardless of what anyone else thought she could handle. The next 2 weeks were consumed with preparation for what they all knew was the most critical and dangerous undertaking any of them had ever attempted. Silas approached the challenge with the methodical precision that had kept him alive in the wilderness for 15 years. But he'd never faced stakes this personal or this high. First came the research. Silas had set bones before, his own twice and several times for injured animals, but never anything as complex as deliberate re-breaking and corrective surgery. He spent hours sketching diagrams from memory of anatomical drawings he'd seen in his younger days, trying to recall every detail about bone structure and healing. "The femur connects here," he said, showing Clara his rough drawings by firelight. "The break was here, about 6 inches above the knee. When it healed crooked, it shortened your leg and threw off the alignment of your hip." Clara studied the sketches with intense concentration, asking detailed questions that revealed her sharp intelligence and determination to understand exactly what they were attempting. "What about infection?" she asked. "That's the biggest risk, isn't it?" Silas nodded grimly. "I've got some carbolic acid I trade for in Fort Collins. It's what army surgeons use to clean wounds. But Clara," he met her eyes directly, "there's no way to eliminate the risk entirely. If infection sets in, especially bone infection, it could be fatal." "I understand." Her calm acceptance of the dangers amazed him. This was the same woman who had apologized for being a burden when she was burning with fever. Now she was facing the possibility of death with steady courage, because the alternative, living the rest of her life believing herself broken, had become unacceptable. The makeshift surgical tools took days to prepare. Silas carved handles for his sharpest knives, fashioned a bone saw from a metal blade, and created splints from carefully selected pieces of wood. Every tool was tested, sharpened, and sterilized with boiling water and carbolic acid until he was satisfied they would serve their purpose. Martha threw herself into the preparations with desperate intensity, as if perfect organization could somehow atone for 15 years of deception. She prepared bandages from their cleanest fabric, organized supplies, and created detailed schedules for post-surgical care. "I've been thinking about the timing," she said one evening as they reviewed their plans. "If we do this at the end of February, Clara will have March and April to heal before the weather clears enough for travel." "I'm not traveling anywhere," Clara said quietly. Both Martha and Silas looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" Martha asked. Clara set down the flower arrangement she'd been working on, a design that incorporated pressed violets with fresh pine needles, somehow making the combination look both wild and refined. "I mean that regardless of how the surgery turns out, I'm not leaving this mountain. This is where I want to build my life." She looked directly at Silas as she spoke, and he felt his heart stop, then resume beating at twice its normal pace. "Clara, Martha began, her voice careful. You can't make decisions like that based on circumstances when you're recovered, when you can see your options clearly. My options are clear now, Clara interrupted. Clearer than they've ever been. I'm not a girl who needs other people to decide what's best for her. I'm a woman who knows what she wants. The declaration hung in the air like a challenge. Silas found himself studying Clara's face, looking for certainty or doubt, and finding only quiet determination. "And what do you want?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I want to stay here with you. I want to build something lasting in a place where I can be myself without apology. I want to find out who I am when I'm not trying to make everyone else comfortable." Martha's face cycled through shock, hurt, and finally a kind of resigned understanding. "And if the surgery doesn't work? If you're bedridden for months? If complications arise? Then I'll face those challenges here, with someone who sees my worth regardless of my physical limitations." Clara's eyes never left Silas's face as she spoke. He felt the weight of her trust, her hope, her willingness to bet her future on his ability to love her as she was, rather than as he might want her to be. "Clara," he said carefully, "what you're suggesting, it changes everything. Not just your recovery, but our relationship, our future together. I know. You'd be committing to a life that's isolated, harsh, sometimes dangerous. Mountain winters are brutal. Medical help is days away, even in good weather. I know. And you'd be committing to a man who's spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of connection, who might not know how to be the partner you deserve." Clara's smile was gentle but unwavering. "I'd be committing to a man who spent weeks caring for a stranger's welfare before his own comfort. A man who's teaching me that strength comes in many forms, and that love doesn't require perfection from either person." The conversation continued late into the night, touching on practical considerations and deeper questions about the kind of life they wanted to build together. Martha listened with growing understanding that her sister was choosing a path that didn't include her central presence. "What about me?" Martha asked finally, her voice small. Clara reached over and took her sister's hand. "You're strong enough to build any life you choose. You always have been. But you need to build it for yourself, not as someone's protector or caretaker. I don't know how to do that. You'll learn. The same way I'm learning to make choices based on what I want, rather than what other people think I should want." The next morning brought a new dynamic to their preparations. Where before they had been planning Clara's recovery as a temporary period before returning to their original plans, now they were designing a permanent life together. The surgery became not just about healing her leg, but about giving her the physical freedom to fully participate in the mountain life she had chosen. Silas found himself imagining scenarios he'd never allowed himself to consider. Clara, strong and healthy, working beside him in the garden he'd plant for her, exploring the mountain trails together, building the kind of partnership that could withstand both hardship and joy. But he also forced himself to confront darker possibilities. If the surgery failed, if Clara was permanently weakened or worse, would he be able to care for her without resentment? Would his love be strong enough to handle a future that looked nothing like what they hoped for? The questions haunted him as he made final preparations for the procedure. He sharpened his tools one more time, reviewed his anatomical sketches until he could picture every bone and muscle, and tried to prepare mentally for the moment when Clara's life would literally be in his hands. On the night before the surgery, Martha made an announcement that surprised them both. "I've decided to leave," she said during their evening meal. "Not permanently, but for the recovery period. There's a settlement 2 days' walk south. I scouted it during my hunting trips. I can stay there, work for my keep, and give you both the space you need for Clara's healing. Martha, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." Martha's voice was firm but not unkind. "Clara's right that I need to learn to build a life for myself. And you both need to discover your relationship without me as a constant reminder of old complications." The decision felt right, though it also underscored the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Tomorrow," Silas would perform surgery that could transform Clara's life or end it, and they would face the outcome alone together. As they prepared for sleep, Clara asked for her music box. The lullaby filled the cabin one more time, but now it sounded less like nostalgia and more like a benediction, a blessing on the courage to reach for the life you wanted, rather than accepting the one you'd been given. "Are you afraid?" Silas asked in the darkness. "Terrified," Clara admitted, "but not of the surgery. I'm afraid of hoping too much, of discovering that even with a healed leg, I still won't be brave enough to claim the happiness that feels so close I can almost touch it. You're the bravest person I've ever known. Then tomorrow, we'll find out if courage is enough." Outside, the wind continued its eternal conversation with the pines, and the stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had guided travelers and dreamers long before any of them were born. Inside the cabin, 3 people faced the last night of their old lives, preparing for a dawn that would change everything they thought they knew about limitation, love, and the courage required to reach for both. Dawn came grey and cold, with snow falling in thick, silent flakes that muffled all sound beyond the cabin walls. Silas had been awake since before first light, reviewing his plans and sterilizing his tools for the final time. His hands remained steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs with the knowledge that in a few hours he would deliberately break the leg of the woman he loved. Clara sat at the table, fully dressed and composed, clutching a small, smooth stone she'd found by the creek during their first week together. She told him it reminded her of strength, how water could shape even the hardest granite given enough time and patience. "My courage stone," she said when she noticed him watching. "Something to hold on to when the pain gets too much to bear." Martha moved around the cabin with nervous efficiency, making final preparations for her departure and Clara's surgery. She had packed her few belongings and prepared enough food for several days, planning to leave immediately after the procedure to give Clara and Silas privacy for the crucial first hours of recovery. "The laudanum is here," Martha said, placing the small brown bottle beside Silas's surgical tools. "It's all we have, so use it carefully." Silas nodded, though they all knew the meager supply of pain medication would barely touch what Clara was about to endure. Frontier surgery was brutal under the best circumstances, and these were far from the best circumstances. "Are you ready?" he asked Clara. She closed her fingers around the courage stone and met his eyes with steady determination. "I'm ready." They had arranged the bed near the window to maximize the available light. Clara lay down and positioned her damaged leg according to Silas's instructions, while Martha held her hand and offered what comfort she could. "Remember," Silas said as he administered the laudanum, "the pain will be severe, but it won't last forever. Hold on to that stone, and hold on to the knowledge that this is your choice. You're taking control of your own life." Clara nodded, already beginning to feel the effects of the medication, but her eyes remained focused and aware as Silas made his final preparations. The first incision was clean and precise, guided by months of study and planning. Clara's grip on both the stone and Martha's hand tightened, but she made no sound beyond sharp intakes of breath. Blood welled up immediately, and Silas worked quickly to control the bleeding while exposing the mishealed bone beneath. "I can see it," he murmured, partly to himself and partly to reassure Clara. "The bone fused at an angle, just like we thought. It's going to break clean." What came next was the hardest thing Silas had ever done. Using controlled force and precise leverage, he rebroke Clara's leg along the line of the original fracture. The sound was sharp and final, like a branch snapping in winter wind. Clara's scream tore through the cabin, a sound of such pure agony that Martha sobbed in response. But even through the pain, Clara maintained her grip on the courage stone, using it as an anchor while waves of suffering crashed over her. "It's done," Silas said quickly, his own hands shaking now with reaction. "The break is clean, Clara, perfect for healing straight and strong." He worked swiftly to set the bone in proper alignment, using techniques he'd learned from both animal doctoring and half-remembered medical texts. The positioning had to be exact, Too much pressure and he could damage nerves or blood vessels. Too little and the bone might heal crooked again. How does it look? Clara asked through gritted teeth, her face pale and slick with sweat. Better than I dared hope, Silas replied honestly. The bone is sitting exactly where it should. If infection doesn't set in, if the healing goes well, you should have full use of your leg. The splinting process took another hour, with Silas carefully immobilizing the leg to ensure the bone would fuse in proper alignment. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness as the laudanum and shock took their toll, but whenever she was aware, her first concern was not for her own comfort, but for his state of mind. "You did everything right," she whispered during one lucid moment. "Whatever happens now, you gave me the chance I needed." Martha sat beside the bed throughout the procedure, holding Clara's free hand and wiping the sweat from her brow. Her face was streaked with tears of guilt and admiration. Guilt for the years of deception that had made this surgery necessary, and admiration for the sister who was brave enough to reclaim her future despite the risks. "I need to clean and dress the wound," Silas said as he finished the splinting. "Then we wait and see how your body responds." The antiseptic carbolic acid burned like fire when applied to the surgical site, drawing another cry of pain from Clara despite the laudanum. But the wound looked clean, and the bleeding had stopped, both encouraging signs for healing. "Martha should go now," Clara said as Silas bandaged the incision. "While I'm still groggy enough that saying goodbye won't be too difficult." The parting between the sisters was both tender and awkward. Weighted with 15 years of complicated history and the uncertainty of what their relationship would look like going forward. Martha kissed Clara's forehead and whispered apologies and prayers in equal measure. "Take care of her," Martha said to Silas as she shouldered her pack. "I will." And Silas, "Thank you for giving her this chance, for seeing her worth when I was too blind and selfish to recognize it myself." After Martha left, the cabin fell into profound quiet, broken only by Clara's labored breathing and the soft sound of falling snow. Silas sat beside the bed, monitoring Clara's pulse and temperature, watching for any signs of complications. "How long until we know if it worked?" Clara asked during one of her more alert moments. "Several weeks for the bone to begin fusing properly. Months before you can put weight on it. But we'll know much sooner if infection sets in." Clara nodded and closed her eyes again, exhausted by the trauma her body had endured. Silas continued his vigil, alternating between hope and terror, as he watched the woman he loved fight through the most critical hours of her recovery. As evening approached, Clara's fever began to rise, a normal response to surgical trauma, but still frightening. Silas applied cool cloths to her forehead and forced small sips of water between her parched lips. While outside, the snow continued falling, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary for what could be the most important weeks of their lives together. 3 weeks after the surgery, Clara took her first tentative steps with the walking stick Silas had carved for her from mountain ash. The wood was smooth and strong, perfectly balanced for her height and grip, with delicate wildflower patterns etched along its length, a functional tool that was also a work of art. "Easy," Silas cautioned, hovering close enough to catch her if she fell. "Just let the stick bear most of your weight." Clara's face was tight with concentration and determination as she placed the stick, moved her healing leg carefully forward, then shifted her weight. One step, then another. Her breathing came hard with the effort, but her eyes shone with joy that made Silas's heart swell. "It doesn't hurt," she said in wonder. "Not the way it used to. There's pain from the healing, but not that constant ache I've lived with for 15 years. The bone was mending better than either of them had dared hope. Where Clara's left leg had once been noticeably shorter than her right, the corrected alignment had restored her natural proportions. The limp that had defined her movement for so long was barely noticeable now, masked by the temporary weakness of healing rather than permanent deformity. "Another few steps?" Clara asked, already positioning the walking stick for forward movement. Silas nodded, though his protective instincts urged caution. Clara had been through the Valley of Shadows during the first week after surgery, fever, infection fears, and pain that tested the limits of human endurance. But she had emerged stronger, more determined, and somehow more herself than she had ever been. "I've been thinking," Clara said, as she practiced walking the length of the cabin, "about what we want to build here. Not just survival, but a real life together." During her weeks of bed rest, they had talked about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears about the future. Silas had shared stories about Sarah and Thomas that transformed his grief from a wall between them into a bridge to deeper understanding. Clara had spoken about her mother's artistic dreams and her own quiet hopes for a life where she could create beauty without apology. "What kind of life?" Silas asked, steadying her as she turned at the end of the cabin. "A garden," Clara said immediately. "I want to plant flowers and vegetables, create something that feeds both body and soul. And I want to expand your cabin, add a room where I can work on my flower pressing, maybe even try painting again." Her excitement was infectious. Silas found himself imagining their mountain refuge transformed from a bachelor's practical shelter into a true home. Windows filled with morning light, walls decorated with Clara's artwork, the sound of her humming while she worked in the garden. "We could raise chickens," he suggested. "Maybe a milk cow if we can build proper shelter for winter." "And books," Clara added, lowering herself carefully into a chair by the fire. "I want shelves full of books, stories and poetry and scientific texts. I want to learn everything about mountain plants and animals, about weather patterns and seasonal changes." They spent the evening planning their future home with the enthusiasm of children designing a perfect fort. But beneath the excitement ran a deeper current of intimacy, the knowledge that they were choosing each other not just for love, but as true partners in building something lasting. "Clara," Silas said as they prepared for sleep, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said weeks ago." She looked up from arranging her blankets, and he saw both curiosity and slight apprehension in her expression. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because you're brave, though you are. Not because you're kind, though that's true too. I love you because you see beauty in things other people overlook, because you find strength in places other people see only weakness. I love the way you make ordinary moments feel sacred." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you that first night when you could have turned us away, but chose kindness instead. You made me feel seen, not as someone's burden or responsibility, but as a person worth knowing." The declaration felt like a completion, the final piece of a puzzle they'd been solving together for months. They had moved from strangers to companions to something deeper than either had expected to find again. Over the following days, Clara's strength returned with remarkable speed. The walking stick became less necessary as her leg grew accustomed to bearing weight properly aligned. She began taking short walks outside the cabin, marveling at how differently the world looked when she could move through it without constant discomfort. "Everything seems larger," she told Silas after one of these excursions. "More possible. I never realized how much my limitations had shaped what I allowed myself to hope for." They were sitting on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and pink. Clara's walking stick leaned against the porch rail beside them, still necessary for long distances, but more of a precaution now than a requirement. "What do you hope for now?" Silas asked. Clara was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I hope for morning conversations over coffee while we plan our day's work. I hope for evenings like this, when we can sit together and watch the world settle into peace. I hope for challenges we can face together and joys we can share." She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. "And I hope for children if we're blessed with them. Little ones who will grow up thinking strength comes in many forms, and that love is measured by understanding rather than perfection. The image of children, his and Clara's children, growing up in their mountain." Sanctuary filled Silas with a happiness so intense it was almost painful. After losing Thomas, he had never allowed himself to imagine becoming a father again. but the possibility of raising children with Clara, of teaching them to read the mountain's moods and appreciate their mother's gentle wisdom, seemed like a gift beyond deserving. "We should be married," he said suddenly. "Properly married, with vows spoken and promises made." Clara turned to look at him with surprise and delight. "Are you asking me to marry you, Silas McGraw?" "I'm asking if you'll have me, Clara Whitmore." Gruff mountain man, with more scars than social graces, but who promises to love you as you are and support who you're becoming. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you. In the spring when the mountain flowers bloom, when I can walk to my own wedding without assistance." They sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of hope and commitment, sitting on their porch as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and accepting, as if the wilderness itself was blessing their decision to build love in the midst of its beautiful harshness. That night, as they lay in their separate blankets for what would be one of the last times, Clara spoke into the darkness. "Silas?" "Yes? Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me before I was healed. That meant more than the surgery, more than walking properly again. You loved me when I couldn't love myself. Thank you for teaching me that healing doesn't always mean forgetting, that love can grow in ground that's been broken, maybe even because it's been broken. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines with the sound of countless stories, tales of survival and loss, of love found in unexpected places, of two people who had learned that the strongest foundations are built not on perfection, but on the courage to keep reaching for each other despite the scars. 1 year later, Clara walked down the aisle of their mountain wedding without any assistance at all. The ceremony took place in the meadow behind their expanded cabin, surrounded by the wildflowers Clara had planted and nurtured through her first spring as a mountain woman. Purple lupines and Indian paintbrush swayed in the gentle breeze, creating a natural cathedral more beautiful than any church either of them had ever seen. Martha had returned for the wedding, bringing with her a Methodist preacher from the settlement where she'd spent the winter and spring. She looked different, more confident and settled in herself, with the bearing of a woman who had learned to define her own worth rather than seeking it through others' needs. "You look radiant," Martha said as she helped Clara with the simple white dress they'd sewn together during long evenings by the fire. "And you look complete, like you found exactly where you belong." Clara studied her reflection in the small mirror Silas had traded for in Fort Collins. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened, self-doubting person who had stumbled into this mountain sanctuary a year ago. This woman stood straight and strong, her eyes bright with confidence and joy. "I have found where I belong," Clara replied, adjusting the crown of mountain flowers Martha had woven for her hair. "Not just in this place, but in my own skin, in my own choices." The ceremony was simple but profound. Silas stood waiting in his best clothes, clean buckskins and a white shirt Clara had made for him, with wedding rings he'd carved from mountain pine in his hands. The rings were simple bands, but each one was inlaid with tiny pressed flowers from Clara's collection, making them unique works of art that told the story of their love. "Do you, Silas McGraw, take Clara Whitmore to be your wife?" the preacher asked, his voice carrying across the meadow to where a small gathering of mountain neighbors had come to witness their union. "I do," Silas replied, his voice steady and sure. "I take her as my partner in all things, in joy and sorrow, in strength and weakness, in the work of building a life worth living." "And do you, Clara Whitmore, take Silas McGraw to be your husband?" Clara looked into Silas's eyes and saw reflected there all the love and acceptance she had never dared hope to find. "I do. I take him as my equal and companion, to share in all the adventures and challenges that lie ahead." As they exchanged rings and spoke their vows, the mountains around them seemed to approve with subtle shifts of light and shadow. Birds called from the surrounding forest, and the creek that ran past their cabin provided a gentle soundtrack of flowing water over smooth stones. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced, And Silas did, thoroughly and joyfully, while their small congregation cheered and the mountain flowers nodded in the breeze. The celebration that followed was exactly what Clara had dreamed of. Simple, heartfelt, and filled with the kind of authentic joy that comes from people who have learned to appreciate life's genuine blessings. They shared a feast, prepared from their own garden and hunting, danced to Martha's guitar playing, and told stories as the sun set behind the peaks. But the most perfect moment came late in the evening, when Clara and Silas slipped away from their guests to sit on their porch and watch the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "Mrs. McGraw," Silas said, testing out the sound of her new name. "I like the sound of that," Clara replied, snuggling closer to her husband's warmth. "Though I'll miss being Clara Whitmore. She was stronger than I gave her credit for, she was. And Clara McGraw will be stronger still, because she knows her own worth now." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of their mountain home, wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the soft murmur of their guests settling down for the night in the meadow camp they'd established for the celebration. "Silas," Clara said softly, "I have something to tell you. A wedding gift, you might say." Something in her tone made him turn to look at her more closely. In the starlight, he could see she was smiling with a particular kind of joy that made his heart skip. "We're going to have a baby," she said simply. "Come late winter, if my calculations are right." For a moment, Silas couldn't speak. The joy was too large, too overwhelming for words. A baby, their baby, growing up in this place they had built together, surrounded by love and mountains, and the infinite possibilities that came with being wanted and cherished. "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though his expression had already given her the answer. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, pulling her close and kissing her temple. "Amazed, grateful, terrified, hopeful, all of it at once." "Good," Clara said with satisfaction. "That sounds exactly right for people about to become parents." They talked late into the night about their hopes for their child, about the kind of life they wanted to create for their growing family. The cabin would need another addition, they decided. The garden would need expansion, and they would need to start planning for their child's education, books and learning, and exposure to the wider world. But grounded in the values they had discovered in their mountain sanctuary, what will we teach them about strength? Clara wondered aloud. "That it comes in many forms," Silas replied, without hesitation. "That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. That love requires both independence and interdependence, knowing your own worth and choosing to share your life with someone who sees that worth clearly." As the celebration wound down around them and their guests settled into sleep, Clara and Silas remained on their porch, making plans and sharing dreams under the vast mountain sky. They had traveled far from the frightened, broken people who had found each other in a snowstorm. She had learned to claim her own strength, and he had learned that isolation was not the same as peace. The morning would bring new challenges and continued work on the life they were building together. There would be a baby to prepare for, a farm to expand, neighbors to help and be helped by in return. There would be storms to weather and joys to celebrate, the ordinary struggles and satisfactions that make up a human life fully lived. But tonight, they simply sat together in the place they had chosen to call home, listening to the eternal conversation between wind and trees, grateful for the journey that had brought them to each other, and excited about all the tomorrows stretching ahead. Sometimes love finds us in the places we least expect it, changing everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Sometimes the heart sees what the eyes refuse to notice, and sometimes the person we think is weakest turns out to be the strongest of all. In the mountains of their new life together, Silas and Clara had discovered that the most beautiful foundations are built not on perfection, but on the courage to keep reaching for each other despite the scars, to keep believing in love even when the world tries to convince us we don't deserve it. As the first light of dawn touched the peaks around their mountain home, two people who had found their way to each other against all odds prepared to face whatever came next. secure in the knowledge that some bonds are strong enough to weather any storm, and some loves are deep enough to last forever.